This romance was a new chapter for him, an opportunity to live a youthful life with someone that's very beautiful.
They were headed back to Southern California to celebrate their first Thanksgiving together.
The smell coming out of the bag is not something you can describe.
So the coroner investigator comes out, and he said, "This is a human."
And the lifestyle that she thought she was going to live was all a lie.
Things started to fall apart a little bit.
She wanted payback.
I did all this in 2 hours. Shut him up.
That's strange. And not only strange, that is insane.
I couldn't believe I did what I did.
In the city of Costa Mesa, the California dream is alive and well.
Costa Mesa is a relatively small town, and it is sunny all the time. A lot of people will settle in Costa Mesa because they can be so close to the beach without having to buy really expensive property.
It's around 2 p.m. on December 1st, 1991, when Costa Mesa resident Jose Escoval calls 911. He tells the operator of a concerning interaction he just had with his ex-girlfriend.
Jose receives a knock on his door.
He did look out the window and see a red Corvette in his driveway. Didn't recognize the car. He opened the door, and it was a former girlfriend, somebody that had lived with him on and off. They'd broken up a year ago, but still maintained a relationship. She was very disheveled, very upset, had gloves on her hands, wanted his help. So he invited her into the apartment, and she sat down and basically told him she wanted to elicit his help, his car, to get rid of her husband's body.
He says, "Hold on, just stay right there."
As soon as he was able to get out of her presence, he went straight to a payphone to call the police and say, "Hey, I need some help."
He identifies the woman as Omaima Nelson. Her husband's name is Bill.
Police dispatchers told him to stay put. An officer would meet with him very soon.
Born in 1935 and raised in Texas, Bill Nelson left a big impression.
Bill was a flamboyant kind of a man. He drove a red Corvette.
He was a dyed-in-the-wool Texan, known for his red cowboy boots and big belt buckles, and gregarious personality, fun to be around, liked to engage people, had a very bubbly personality, told tall tales and things of that nature.
This guy was larger than life in more ways than one. I mean, we're talking 6'4", 230 pounds, wearing red cowboy boots and a red hat. And many people, they took to Bill.
Bill Nelson had several wives, and he had kids with those wives, and he had grandkids with those kids. His first wife, I believe they lived in Florida, and his second wife in Texas, his third wife in Texas.
To earn a living, Bill was a jack of all trades.
Bill Nelson was a pilot. He crop dusted. He had a knowledge of computers to the point where he could take old ones apart and reassemble them and then at some point sell them. He also worked for a mortgage company.
By the early 90s, Bill was living in California. In the fall of 1991, he met a beautiful young woman who was also half his age.
One night at the pool hall, Omaima, she walks in, just kind of perusing the place. He said, "Who is that? Those high cheekbones, that beautiful hair?" She was this Egyptian goddess, and he wanted to know more. Omaima was born in southern Egypt along the Nile River, kind of near the Sudanese border, and she was really born into a village that was really poor.
Omaima was raised in a Muslim household. She was devout. She met a oil worker while she was back in Egypt, and they started a relationship. When her mother heard that the relationship was getting kind of serious, she insisted that they get married. And at some point after the marriage, he was called back to Houston, Texas, and she accompanied him.
Around age 18, Omaima is faced with the possibility of the American dream, to live a totally different life. When she arrived, she spoke minimal English. Imagine being in a country where you are not able to stand up for yourself, you're not able to communicate your basic needs outside of your partner, you rely on him for everything.
He turned out to be a violent man. So she became a battered woman at 18 here in America. She managed to get help from a battered women's shelter and get away from him.
In 1987, Omaima left Texas and headed for California.
After divorcing her first husband, she moved in with her sister in San Clemente, California, located south of Costa Mesa. And she took up several jobs, one of which was being a model at some lingerie place in the mall.
She was a beautiful, beautiful woman with high cheekbones and, people would look her way. But the money wasn't coming in fast enough. She wanted more. She was attracted to these older men. To her, they provided protection, they provided stability, and they provided money.
Omaima had the belief that if she found a nice older man, that man would both take care of her and be kind.
And at 23 years old, Omaima met 56-year-old Bill Nelson at a bar.
She sees a big old statuesque guy. He was commanding the entire room, telling his stories, had everybody captivated.
Bill wooed Omaima with his cowboy persona and promises of a better life.
He may have mentioned that he, lived a lavish life, had a red Corvette, may have even owned a cattle ranch.
For Mr. Nelson, I imagine this romance was a new chapter for him, an opportunity to live a young, joyful, youthful life with someone that's very beautiful.
Once Omaima and Bill Nelson met each other, they were inseparable for days at a time, even a couple of weeks before he decided, you know what, I want you to meet my family. So they took a road trip to Arkansas and Texas, and that's where his family was. And on that trip, they made a big decision. He made the decision to propose to her, and not just propose, but within a day, it's time to get married.
And he drove to Phoenix, Arizona, where a justice of the peace married him.
The newlyweds continued their road trip, sharing the good news with Bill's family.
Omaima was elated. She finally found a family that she felt like she gelled with. She really felt this sense of belonging thanks to Bill, her new husband.
Following the road trip, the couple looked forward to spending the holidays together.
They were headed back to Southern California to celebrate their first Thanksgiving together.
But 3 days after Thanksgiving, Omaima's ex, Jose Escobar, calls 911 to report that Omaima showed up at his doorstep, asking him to help move Bill's body.
Police dispatchers told him to stay put, that they'd have officers running over to his house on Monte Vista, but an officer would meet with him very soon.
While Jose waits at the payphone, officers head to his home.
When police get to Joel's residence, Omaima's inside. And one of the officers goes inside to speak with her, start asking her some questions.
She's dressed all in black. She's got a black blazer on, black pants, even black leather gloves on her hands.
When asked about her husband, Omaima says he is out of town.
He'd spent Thanksgiving with her on Thursday, and on Friday he'd left for a business trip, and she expected him back the following Friday. Asked her kind of the circumstances around her connection to Jose, and she said she'd known him, past boyfriend. She'd come over to see if she could stay there because Bill was gone.
There was another police officer, a couple of them outside, and that's when they spotted that red Corvette.
We looked inside the Corvette. Officer Hoke spotted a 50-gallon trash bag. which was tied at the top, sitting on the front seat. So Officer Hogue removed it and set it down on the front yard grass and cut it open with a penknife. The smell is not something you can describe.
On December 1st, 1991, a bizarre scene is unfolding at a home in Costa Mesa, California.
Parked out front of the location was a Corvette, and Officer Hogue looked inside and saw a big trash bag that was tied at the top, sitting in plain view. Then Officer Hogue cut the bag open with a penknife he had. At that point, we could see a liquid substance in the bag, and the smell that was emanating from the bag was so powerful.
Meanwhile, officers find the homeowner, Jose Escoval, at a nearby payphone. Jose explains what prompted him to call 911.
About 2 in the afternoon, somebody was knocking on the door, and he looked out, saw the red Corvette, opened the door, and it was Omaima. She removed the black gloves that she was wearing. He saw that her hands had been cut with what looked like a knife. She had bruises on her arms, on her legs, so he invited her into the apartment.
She says, "I need your help." Jose says, "With what?" She tells him that her husband attacked her and she ended up killing him.
She killed him, cut him up. She had a trash bag in the car right now and would pay him a huge sum of money if he would just help her.
"I just need to move his body." And then she offers him $75,000 and 2 motorcycles if he actually obliges. He says, "Hold on, just stay right there."
Jose left the house and found a payphone and called 911.
Back at Jose's house, a grim discovery is underway.
The whole show was this bag that was in the back of the Corvette. One of the officers had taken the bag out of the car, opened it up. I look inside the bag, and I'm not really sure what I'm looking at. It just looks kind of nasty. I said, you know, this could be pig entrails for all I know. The thing that went through my mind, I need to identify this as human. Because I'm still thinking, this is some kind of gag. This is some kind of misdirection of some sort. I'm just still not believing that this is human internal parts that are in this bag. So we're going to need a coroner out here. So the coroner investigator comes out. We opened up a big plastic cloth to the ground, and we got the remains out onto the cloth. And then all of a sudden he says, "Hey, you better look at this." I go, "What?" He says, "Do you know what those little black spots on this organ is?" I said, "I got no idea what that is." He said, "That's carbon." I said, "It is?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "You know where that comes from?" I said, "No." He said, "It comes from smoking." And he said, "So unless you know any pigs that smoke, this is a human."
Investigators turn to Omaima.
We introduced ourselves, said obviously we don't want to really be talking out here on the street. Would you mind accompanying us to the police department for an interview? And she agreed.
But law enforcement has another priority before they talk to Omaima.
We were able to determine from her identification where she lived with her husband.
Officers immediately went over to that apartment to see if there was, somebody in distress, somebody hurt.
It was locked. We obtained a key from the manager. I decided we had exigent circumstances to enter the apartment to see if there was someone inside that was injured and needed medical assistance. Upon entering the apartment, we instantly ascertained that nothing was amiss in the living room. Nothing seemed out of place. Upon entering the bedroom, Officer Hogan and I entered together, and we saw blood spots on the side of a mattress. We then walked back out of the bedroom and entered the kitchen area, which was a mess. Sitting on the counter was a crock pot. There was a lot of dishes in the sink and on the countertop. And for some reason, I decided to open the top freezer door of the refrigerator, and I saw this round object in foil. And I tapped on it with my finger and said to Officer Hogue, "Hey, Danny, I wonder if this is his head or side of ham."
Officers with the Costa Mesa Police Department make troubling discoveries inside the home of Omaima and Bill Nelson.
We saw blood spots on the side of the mattress.
They go to the freezer, open it up, big ball of aluminum foil.
We had the right, upon entering the apartment under exigent circumstances, to look to see what's in plain sight or even in a closet. But we would need a search warrant to get back into the apartment and to make a detailed search.
As they wait for the warrant to come through, investigators conduct an interview with Omaima.
We got to the station and escorted her to an interview room. She wanted a cigarette. It was obvious that she was distressed. She was talking a mile a minute. She had cuts and bruises all over her.
I had a fight in Bob.
What happened?
Well, I went for a drink and two girls fight with me there and they got scratched.
Where's Bill away right now? Is he here in town, or is he out of town, or where is he?
He's out of town.
Did you tell Jose today that you killed your husband?
No, I did not.
What do you know about the garbage sack that was in your car?
Well, what is it?
Well, I'm asking you. What do you know about it?
I didn't know nothing about it.
Don't know anything about it? Oh.
Omaima offers an explanation.
She said Jose had, under false pretext, wanted to drive the red Corvette, had left for an hour, and when he came back, that bag must have been in it. So Jose must have put the bag in the car. Then she said she'd been to a laundromat doing laundry earlier in the day and decided to walk next door to a bar, but left her car unlocked. And during that time, somebody must have put a bag behind the front passenger seat. She didn't know anything about it. It would go from one extreme to the other. It was very non-cogent.
The interview goes on, and Omaima's story continues to change.
And then at some point, she said that Bill had raped her.
He went tied me up. And I said, no, don't tie me up.
What did he tie you to?
To the bed.
Did you kill Bill because he did this to you? Tell me the truth of it.
I didn't burn.
Just after 10 p.m., the interview ends, as Omaima is escorted to the hospital for a physical examination.
A search warrant was granted for the premises, and I responded over to serve the search warrant at about 2 in the morning.
Investigators start in the bedroom, where the patrol officer spotted blood.
Next to what I presume was Bill's side of the bed were a pair of red cowboy boots and some boot shining materials on a rug. To the first eye, it looks okay.
The bed was made, mattress was on top. You lift the mattress and the blood was underneath it.
It's saturated with blood and the box spring. And then you realize that there was a headboard at one point on that bed, but the headboard was broken into several pieces, and it was stashed behind the head of the bed. Did a search of the closet. small steam iron in the corner of the closet was broken. The handle was broken off of it. Wrapped up in newspaper in the closet was also a porcelain lamp that had been broken and a crushed lampshade.
Investigators moved to the living room.
There was boxes piled up, computer parts piled up, laying around.
We saw that most all of these boxes contained trash bags, and in those trash bags were other trash bags, and in those trash bags were what appeared to be human body parts.
The disturbing scene becomes even more troubling.
We did find a box that had 2 human hands in it. It was obvious that the hands were cooked. They looked to be fried or something. Detectives were searching the kitchen, and officers started going through the refrigerator, the freezer.
They locate the large item wrapped in foil.
Take that out, open it up. It looked like a human head. I mean, that looked like a prop out of a horror movie, is what it looked like.
And also wrapped in a piece of tinfoil were genitals, male genitals. The genitals appeared as if they'd also been cooked and wrapped in tinfoil.
This is a house of horrors. It was pretty shocking.
Investigators question whether Omaima is physically capable of such violence.
The thing for me is she's petite, and I knew from Mr. Nelson's driver's license that he was, over 6 foot, 250 pounds. But in one particular box, in amongst the trash bags, were a pair of human legs, and those legs had ligature marks around the ankles. At the foot of the bed was a wicker clothes hamper full of dirty clothes, and in amongst those clothes were what appeared to be bloody garments. There was a necktie, men's necktie that was tied like a ligature. There was a section of rope that had some knots in it that appeared to be a ligature.
She says that Bill tied her to a bed, but Bill was the one with ligature marks. So everything she was saying was a lie.
On the morning of December 2nd, 1991, Omaima Nelson returns to the Costa Mesa police station following an examination at a local hospital. She is met with handcuffs.
Well, I'm going to be placing you under arrest at this time.
Why?
For suspicion of murder.
I didn't kill him. I didn't kill him.
I remember driving with my partner down to the coroner's office to witness the autopsy. We get to the coroner's office, and the watch commander calls and says, "Hey, Omaima wants to talk to you again."
Just tell me what you want to tell me and I'll listen.
I think I did kill him unconscious.
You think you killed him unconscious?
Yeah, because he did this to me, and I couldn't believe I did what I did.
Omaima claimed that her husband became physically abusive shortly after the wedding. She told police that she began to cope with the abuse through drinking alcohol and using drugs. During this time, she also told them that she started having visual hallucinations and auditory hallucinations, telling her to murder her husband.
So all I remember that I hit him to self-defense or something.
How did you hit him?
I think I hit him with the lamp or something to get off me.
How did you kill him?
I don't remember how I killed him.
Omaima does remember bits of the gory events that followed.
I did all this in 2 hours. Chopped him up pieces in 2 hours.
Chopped you up? Bill in 2 hours?
Yeah. And all I remember that his hand was flying from his body, hit the ceiling up there, and made a blood in the ceiling. And I fall asleep, and I get up in the morning, and I found the trash bag, and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe what happened.
She said that she heard voices. The Egyptian gods were helping her, telling her things.
She was telling me that who killed, he must die. Who killed, he killed. And she turned around and she walked away. And the next when I get up, I checked, I find my name and his name was written by blood in the mirror. It said, me and you.
What was written in blood?
Me and you.
Did you cook some parts of Bill before you wrapped him up in the plastic?
No, I'm not eating eater much either. I don't eat meat.
You don't eat meat?
No, I don't eat meat.
You're a vegetarian?
Vegetarian, yes.
She would go from voices, I'm hearing people from the dead telling me these things, and Bill's head's here, and he's cut up, and there's body parts all over this place. She didn't really confess to anything other than she blacked out, she heard voices, there was a phone call, somebody said, look in the freezer, look in the trash bags. It didn't make any sense. There's no continuity to this thing. She was all over the map.
Well, I think you're telling me part of the truth, but not all of it.
Well, I think I need to talk to the psychiatrist to get this to the last of my life.
We kind of sized her up as somebody that was just grasping at straws, trying to work herself out of this bad situation.
Following the interrogation, investigators get word that the coroner has positively identified the remains as Bill Nelson.
The coroner's office made a notification to next of kin. Bill's wife in Santa Maria, California was notified. He also had a son in Los Angeles.
I hate it for the family that has to even live through this because it's horrible. And truly, it is your worst nightmare.
Following her arrest, Omaima meets with multiple mental health professionals. Her story changes again and takes a shocking turn.
She was also able to provide gruesome details about the things that she did to her husband. Some of these details include dismembering her husband, boiling her husband, deep frying parts of his body.
She talked about cooking her husband, that his ribs tasted sweet. She put barbecue sauce on them and things of that nature.
That's strange. And not only strange, that is insane.
Investigators consider whether Omaima is telling the truth or setting up her defense.
It was really hard to believe that that happened. It really was.
Like one line, she was trying to say self-defense. The other line, she was trying to say criminal insanity.
It was obvious that she would throw things out and see what stuck.
Omaima's attorneys hire their own expert. In interviews, Dr. Nancy Kaiser-Boyd delves into Omaima's upbringing in Egypt.
She had a terrible childhood. She'd been sexually assaulted. Her father often beat her, and her stepmother there beat her also.
In addition to her stressful home environment, she lived in a culture during a time where female circumcision was very popular. And so this is something that she experienced very young, at 7 years old.
They took her to a dark place. She remembered it was 3 older women. Her mother wasn't there. She thought they were killing her. She described extraordinary pain and fear, and then she became unconscious. She didn't wake until her mother came and touched her. And by that time, she told me that they were preparing for her burial because they thought she was dead.
Omaima Nelson is behind bars. Accused of brutally dismembering her husband of just a few weeks. In interviews with a psychologist, Omaima reveals she suffered sexual abuse, violence, and female circumcision.
We had her examined by a gynecologist, and that doctor told us that her vaginal area had a lot of scar tissue and that sex would be very painful for her.
During the trial prep, Omaima's defense team, her attorney and investigator, actually flew to this suburb of Cairo. and did in-depth interviews of her family members and to kind of give a glimpse of her childhood growing up and possibly the abuses involved, to show that she'd had a series of dominating males in her life and that she'd experienced not only the circumcision but sexual assault. And so there was definitely some aspects of her past that they were trying to show contributed to this murder.
Detectives and prosecutors prepare to counter whatever defense Omaima brings to court. They speak with medical professionals who examined Omaima on the day of her arrest.
The hospital report concluded that there were no signs of rape or sexual assault.
She also mentioned that she was the one who had been held down and tied to this bedpost. No ligature marks at all around her wrists or her ankles. In fact, medical professionals said she had cuts on her, cuts that came from when she was stabbing Bill.
Investigators reach out to Bill's family, including his ex-wives.
Bill was very acquainted with family and his children. His kids would call him on a fairly regular basis, and yeah, he was just a great dad.
When I spoke to Bill's ex-wife, she spoke very fondly of Bill. And I was struck at one point that she really liked this guy. And she was deeply hurt by what happened to him.
In talking to the family, it was obvious that Bill Nelson was not a violent person. No evidence of that.
Investigators find no record of violence or abuse on Bill's behalf. Omaima is a different story.
One incident included her going to the pharmacy and grabbing whatever she wanted out of there and stealing without paying for this stuff. 2 security guards were watching her, and when they tried to stop her, she got extremely violent with them, so much so she ended up attacking them so viciously that she bit the chest of one of the women, the female security guards. She bit her breast so hard that she almost bit it off, and she also grabbed the vagina of the security guard as well.
As news of the gruesome crime spreads across the state, law enforcement gets a phone call.
Robert Hansen saw the news report of Omaima's crimes against Bill Nelson.
Mr. Robert Hansen, elderly, single, lived in an apartment, fairly successful business person. He met Omaima in a bar, and over conversation, one thing led to another, and she went home with him. Obviously, there was a relationship that started.
At one point during their relationship, they were having sex, and they were doing what she likes to call kinky sex.
She gets over there and ties him up, but instead of doing the kinky sexual thing that she promised, she attempted to rob him and pulls a gun on him. The defendant didn't tie the restraints tight enough because Robert was able to get free and escape from her. But he was so embarrassed that he never called the police. But once he saw the report in the news of Bill Nelson, he had to come forward. He couldn't keep silent because she had done something similar to him and he survived. So this wasn't Omaima's first rodeo.
Over a year after the grisly discovery of Bill Nelson's body, his wife, Omaima, is set to stand trial.
When the case goes to trial, December 1992, prosecutors immediately try to paint Omaima as this woman who wanted this lavish lifestyle that she was promised by Bill Nelson, and she was entitled to get this lifestyle.
Omaima Nelson was an ex-model, beautiful woman of Egyptian descent, very attractive, and she would seek out older men to fleece them for their money.
Bill was talking about being wealthy and owning a cattle ranch and having money, which fit right into what she was looking for. She was looking for another sugar daddy.
Following their whirlwind romance and wedding, a different truth emerged.
things started to fall apart a little bit. She realized that Bill wasn't the man that he might be saying he is. He didn't have that cattle ranch. It became real to her that Bill had purported himself to be something other than he was.
The things that Bill promised her and the lifestyle that she thought she was going to live was all a lie. Bill didn't have any money, and she wanted payback.
On Thanksgiving Day, tensions were high, and Mr. Nelson found himself tied to a bed.
She immobilized him under a false pretext, probably hit him with the iron several times, about 30 times. The iron broke during this assault. Lamp was used, also broken. And then he was stabbed too. And then started cutting him up.
From November 28th till December 1st, she completely destroyed her husband's body.
Next door neighbor, when he interviewed him, he said he was able to hear through their common wall chopping and the sink running and the garbage disposal running, to the point where he believed that the garbage disposal had given up. This activity went on through the early morning hours, quite prolonged.
Prosecutors also call Robert Hansen to the stand.
So Robert's story shows the defendant's modus operandi, and he became a star witness in the prosecution's case against her, showing that she had previously tried to do this to someone else.
Omima's attorneys do not attempt an insanity plea.
Her lawyer argued that this was self-defense or imperfect self-defense, which is a sudden belief that you need to defend yourself by killing the other person.
Dr. Kaiser Boyd takes the stand.
What she told me was that he had her tied to the bed, and he was sitting on top of her, and he was angry, and he had his pocket knife out, and he was cutting her on the breasts. And she, as you can imagine, cutting is a trigger for someone who's had genital circumcision, so she flipped out. And she got loose, and she started hitting him with a lamp by the bed. She jumped up and grabbed an iron that was in the room. And started beating him with that. She said he fell on the bed, and she stabbed him with scissors. She cut him up because she didn't want him to be able to enter the afterlife. The reason Egyptians wrapped their dead and mummified them was so they could enter heaven whole. She told me she hoped if she got to heaven, she would never see him there.
Mama took the stand herself to testify in this case. And she began to share with them in a very emotional, heartfelt testimony about, first of all, her life and the continuous abuse and the trauma and the pain.
She was a victim of sexual assault, of child abuse, of female genital mutilation, and all of this trauma, cumulatively over the years, contributed to her psychological stressors that caused her to do this.
The jury deliberates for 6 days.
I was on needles and pins. I didn't know what the outcome would be.
Ultimately, they came and found her guilty with second-degree murder, and she received 25 years to life.
But Omima's story doesn't end with the verdict.
While in prison, Omima...
The sun was sinking behind the rolling hills of Kerikeri when the last ordinary moments of Liberty Templeman's life quietly slipped away. There was nothing about that Halloween evening in 2008 that seemed unusual. The air was warm. The streets of the small Northland town carried the familiar rhythm of a community settling into another peaceful night. Families were gathering around dinner tables. Teenagers were meeting friends before heading home. Cars moved lazily along narrow roads lined with trees and orchards glowing beneath the fading orange light of sunset. Somewhere among them was 15-year-old Liberty Templeman. She laughed with friends. She made plans. She exchanged messages. She walked through the evening with all the careless confidence of someone who believed tomorrow was guaranteed. Within hours, she would vanish. Within a day, her body would be discovered face down in a shallow stream. And within months, an entire nation would struggle to understand how one teenager could end up dead while another teenager stood accused of taking her life. Because this was not a story about a hardened criminal stalking strangers in the dark. This was something far more unsettling. The victim was only 15 years old. The person eventually convicted of her murder was only 14. 2 children. 2 young lives connected by a tragedy so shocking that it would leave permanent scars on a quiet New Zealand town. Years later, residents of Kerikeri would still remember the feeling that settled over the community during those terrible days. They would remember the missing person posters taped to shop windows. They would remember volunteers searching fields and walking along stream banks. They would remember parents holding their children a little tighter. They would remember the growing fear that spread through the town with every passing hour. And most of all, they would remember the moment hope disappeared. But what makes this case especially haunting is not only the crime itself. It is what happened afterward. As Liberty's family desperately searched for answers, as friends prayed for good news, and as hundreds of people joined the effort to find the missing teenager, one person stood among them. A familiar face. A local boy. Someone who claimed he had seen Liberty shortly before she disappeared. Someone who appeared concerned. Someone who appeared helpful. Someone who, according to prosecutors, already knew exactly where Liberty was. That revelation would send shockwaves through New Zealand. Because if the prosecution's theory was true, then while an entire town was hoping to find Liberty alive, the person responsible for her death was quietly helping search for her body. It sounds like something from a crime novel. Yet it happened in real life. As investigators began piecing together the final hours of Liberty Templeman's life, a disturbing picture slowly emerged. Physical evidence told one story. Witness statements told another. Then there were the changing explanations, the contradictions, and the growing list of details that refused to fit the narrative of an accident. Each new discovery raised another question. What truly happened during those final moments? What could cause a 14-year-old boy to commit an act of violence so severe that it ended a young girl's life? Was this a tragic accident that spiraled out of control? Or was it a deliberate attempt to silence a victim and conceal an even darker crime? For detectives, the answers were buried beneath layers of confusion, fear, and deception. For Liberty's family, the questions were even more painful. Every missing hour represented terror. Every unanswered message represented hope slipping away. Every new piece of evidence brought them closer to a truth no parent ever wants to hear. In the courtroom that would eventually hear the case, jurors would be shown evidence that painted a chilling portrait of Liberty's final moments. They would hear forensic experts describe injuries that could not easily be explained away. They would listen to testimony about a body dragged across rough ground. They would hear about clothing that appeared disturbed. They would learn about conflicting accounts that shifted as investigators uncovered more facts. And at the center of it all stood 2 teenagers. One whose future had been stolen forever. And another whose name would become forever linked to one of New Zealand's most disturbing juvenile murder cases. But before the courtroom, before the headlines, before the verdict, there was Liberty. A daughter. A friend. A teenager standing at the edge of adulthood. Like countless 15-year-olds, she was still figuring out who she wanted to become. She was navigating friendships, relationships, and the exciting uncertainty of growing up. The future stretched out before her in endless possibilities. She had dreams she had not yet pursued. Memories she had not yet made. Places she had not yet seen. And she had absolutely no reason to believe that the evening of October 31st, 2008, would be her last. No one around her knew either. Not her friends. Not her family. Not the people who saw her that day. No one could look at the group of teenagers gathered together and imagine that within 24 hours one of them would be dead and another would become the focus of a murder investigation. That is what makes this story so heartbreaking. There was no warning siren. No dramatic sign of danger. No moment where everyone suddenly understood what was about to happen. There was only an ordinary afternoon. An ordinary conversation. An ordinary goodbye. Then darkness arrived. And by the time the sun rose over Kerikeri the next morning, the town would never be the same again. Because hidden among the trees and waterways of that peaceful community was a secret waiting to be discovered. A secret that would devastate a family, shatter a town's sense of safety, and leave behind questions that continue to echo long after the court case ended. This is the story of Liberty Templeman, a 15-year-old girl who never made it home. And this is the story of how a quiet Halloween evening became one of the most haunting true crime cases in modern New Zealand history. If you had visited Kerikeri in 2008, you probably would have struggled to imagine it becoming the setting for a murder case that would eventually capture the attention of an entire nation. Nestled in the far north of New Zealand, Kerikeri was the kind of place people moved to in search of peace. The town sat among rolling green hills, fruit orchards, winding roads, and pockets of native bush that seemed untouched by time. During the day, the air often carried the scent of citrus groves and freshly cut grass. Local shop owners knew their customers by name. School events drew large crowds. Teenagers wandered between parks, sports grounds, and shopping areas with the confidence that comes from growing up in a community where everyone seemed connected by only a few degrees of separation. Crime existed, as it does everywhere, but serious violent crime felt distant. The sort of thing that happened in larger cities. The sort of thing people watched on television before switching channels and returning to their ordinary lives. For most residents, Kerikeri felt safe. Comfortably safe. Predictably safe. The town moved at a slower pace than Auckland, Wellington, or Christchurch. There was a sense of familiarity in everyday life. Parents often felt comfortable allowing their children a degree of independence that might seem unusual elsewhere. Teenagers walked home after dark. Friends gathered in parks and fields. People trusted one another. That trust would eventually be shattered. But in the years leading up to the tragedy, life continued much as it always had. Among the many families building a life in New Zealand was the Templeman family. Originally from England, they had made the life-changing decision to relocate halfway across the world. Like many immigrants seeking new opportunities and a different lifestyle, they were drawn by the promise of New Zealand's natural beauty, strong communities, and slower pace of life. Moving countries is never simple. It means leaving behind familiar streets, familiar accents, familiar routines, and often an entire network of friends and relatives. For adults, the transition can be challenging. For children and teenagers, it can feel overwhelming. Yet the Templemans embraced their new beginning. Over time, New Zealand became home. And among those adapting to this new life was a young girl named Liberty. Most people knew her simply as Libby. At first glance, she was exactly what you would expect from a teenager entering her mid-teens. She was energetic, social, and eager to spend time with friends. She enjoyed the ordinary experiences that define adolescence. Conversations that lasted longer than they should. Plans made at the last minute. Friendships that felt permanent. Dreams that shifted every few months. People who knew Liberty often described her as friendly and outgoing. She had the kind of personality that naturally drew others toward her. She wasn't someone who preferred isolation. She enjoyed being around people. She laughed easily. She made connections quickly. And like many teenagers, her social world had become one of the most important parts of her life. By 2008, Liberty had spent several years living in Kerikeri. The town had become familiar. Its roads, parks, schools, and gathering places formed the backdrop of her teenage years. The friendships she built there mattered deeply to her. Those relationships would become even more important when another major change arrived. Near the end of 2008, the Templeman family relocated from Kerikeri to Auckland. For adults, moving can represent opportunity. For teenagers, it often feels like loss. Suddenly, familiar faces disappear. Daily routines vanish. Friendships become dependent on distance, transportation, and effort. The move meant Liberty was no longer living in the town she had come to know so well. Yet despite the relocation, her connection to Kerikeri remained strong. Many of her closest friends still lived there. The memories that shaped her teenage years were still there. The places where she had laughed, explored, and grown up were still there. And like many young people facing change, she found reasons to return whenever she could. To outsiders, those visits probably seemed completely normal. A teenager returning to spend time with old friends. A chance to reconnect. A chance to feel at home. A chance to hold on to a part of life that was beginning to slip into the past. Nothing about those visits appeared dangerous. Nothing suggested they would one day become the focus of a homicide investigation. As October 2008 drew to a close, New Zealand was moving deeper into spring. The days were becoming longer. The weather was growing warmer. Trees and gardens across Northland were alive with color. For teenagers, it was a season that encouraged movement and freedom. School terms were progressing. Summer holidays were approaching on the horizon. The future seemed wide open. Halloween itself carried a different atmosphere in New Zealand than it did in countries such as the United States, but it was still recognized by many young people as an excuse to gather, socialize, and enjoy the evening. On October 31st, Liberty found herself back in Kerikeri. To her, it was likely another ordinary visit. A chance to see familiar faces. A chance to spend time with friends she missed. A chance to escape, even briefly, the disruption caused by moving away. Nothing about that day would have felt historic. Nothing about it would have suggested that journalists, investigators, lawyers, and documentary producers would later examine every known detail. The ordinary nature of the day is precisely what makes the story so heartbreaking. Because when tragedy arrives without warning, everyday moments suddenly gain enormous significance. A casual conversation becomes the last conversation. A simple goodbye becomes the final goodbye. A routine decision becomes a turning point. As the afternoon unfolded, groups of teenagers gathered together. Friends talked, laughed, shared stories, made plans. The social world of adolescence continued exactly as it had countless times before. Within those circles was another teenager named Theo Creel. At the time, nobody could know how significant his name would eventually become. He was just another local teenager. Another familiar face. Another student moving through the routines of small-town life. The paths of Liberty and Theo had crossed before. They knew one another. They attended the same school community. Their lives existed within the same social environment. In a small town, such connections are common. People recognize faces. They know names. Friend groups overlap. Acquaintances become familiar even when they are not particularly close. On that October afternoon, there was no visible sign that anything was wrong. No obvious confrontation. No dramatic argument witnessed by crowds. No public incident that caused alarm. The setting remained peaceful. The atmosphere remained ordinary. Yet beneath that normality, events were slowly moving toward a devastating conclusion. One of the most unsettling aspects of many murder cases is how normal everything appears beforehand. Human beings naturally expect disaster to announce itself. We imagine danger arriving with warning signs. Suspicious behavior. Threats. Clear indications that something terrible is approaching. Real life often works differently. Sometimes tragedy develops quietly, silently, invisible to everyone standing nearby. That was the reality in Kerikeri. As daylight gradually faded and evening approached, families across town prepared for another night. Some sat down to dinner. Others watched television. Teenagers arranged transportation, made plans, and exchanged messages. The world continued turning exactly as it had the day before. Yet somewhere within that routine was a countdown nobody could see. The final hours before Liberty Templeman disappeared forever. Years later, People would look back at photographs of her and struggle to reconcile the image of the smiling teenager with the fate that awaited her. Parents throughout New Zealand would imagine their own children in her place. Residents of Kerikeri would replay memories of those days again and again, searching for meaning in moments that once seemed insignificant. Because hindsight changes everything. After a tragedy, every detail appears loaded with importance. Every decision feels consequential. Every missed opportunity becomes painful to consider. But on October 31, 2008, none of those future realizations existed. There was only a teenage girl enjoying time with friends. A small town settling into another spring evening. And a future that, from Liberty's perspective, still seemed limitless. The darkness that would soon descend upon Kerikeri had not yet revealed itself. The community remained unaware. Her family remained unaware. Liberty herself remained unaware. For the moment, she was simply a 15-year-old girl standing in the middle of an ordinary day, surrounded by ordinary people, living ordinary moments. And that is exactly where every great tragedy begins. Not with the crime itself, but with the fragile, unsuspecting normality that exists just before everything changes forever. Before Liberty Templeman became a headline, before investigators mapped out her final movements, before lawyers argued over evidence inside a courtroom, she was simply a 15-year-old girl trying to navigate the complicated, exciting, and often unpredictable world of adolescence. It is easy, when looking back at a true crime case, to see the victim only through the lens of tragedy. A photograph in a newspaper. A name in a police report. A face attached to a crime. But every victim was a living person long before the worst day of their life arrived. They had habits. Dreams. Inside jokes. Favorite songs. Arguments with friends. Plans for the future. The details that made them human. For Liberty Templeman, those details mattered. Because understanding who she was makes what happened to her infinitely more heartbreaking. Liberty, often called Libby by those closest to her, was born in England. Like many children, her early years were filled with experiences that seemed ordinary at the time but would later become treasured memories for her family. There were birthdays, school days, holidays, family photographs, and all the small moments that quietly build a childhood. Then came a major change. In 2005, when Liberty was still young, her family moved from England to New Zealand. Relocating across the world is more than a change of address. It is the beginning of an entirely new life. New schools. New friends. New accents. New customs. New surroundings. For many children, such a transition can feel intimidating. Everything familiar suddenly disappears. The world becomes larger and stranger. Yet over time, New Zealand became home. The rolling landscapes, coastal roads, and close-knit communities of the country slowly replaced the memories of the place she had left behind. As Liberty entered her teenage years, she was growing up in a community where people tended to know one another. The relative safety and openness of life in Kerikeri gave young people freedoms that teenagers in larger cities often lacked. There was space to explore, space to socialize, and space to develop independence. Friends became a central part of Liberty's life. That is hardly surprising. For many teenagers, friendships can feel as important as family. The approval of peers matters. Relationships become intense. Every social gathering feels significant. Every friendship carries emotional weight. Every weekend offers another opportunity to create memories. By all accounts, Liberty embraced that social world. She enjoyed spending time with friends. She enjoyed being part of a group. She enjoyed the freedom that comes with adolescence. People remembered her as outgoing and approachable. She possessed the kind of personality that naturally drew others toward her. She could move comfortably through different social circles. She enjoyed conversations. She enjoyed laughter. She enjoyed feeling connected to the people around her. To those who knew her, Liberty was not defined by a single characteristic. She was not simply the popular girl or the quiet girl. She was more complicated than that, as all real people are. She was a teenager experiencing life in real time. Some days were exciting. Some days were frustrating. Some days felt full of possibility. Others felt uncertain. That uncertainty is a normal part of growing up. At 15, most people are still discovering who they are. They are caught between childhood and adulthood. Old enough to seek independence. Young enough to remain vulnerable. Liberty existed within that space. She was old enough to make plans with friends, travel to visit people she cared about, and begin imagining the person she wanted to become. Yet she was still very much a child. A fact that would later make the circumstances of her death even more devastating. The year 2008 brought another major change. Near the end of the year, the Templeman family moved from Kerikeri to Auckland. For Liberty, the relocation carried a unique emotional challenge. Unlike younger children who often adapt quickly, teenagers are deeply rooted in their social environments. A move can feel like losing an entire world. Schools change. Daily routines disappear. Friendships suddenly require effort to maintain. People who were once part of everyday life become distant. For Liberty, leaving Kerikeri meant leaving behind the community that had helped shape her teenage years. But she wasn't ready to let go of it. The friendships she had built remained important. The town remained important. The life she had created there remained important. So she continued returning whenever she could. Those visits represented more than simple social trips. They represented continuity. A connection to the place where she felt comfortable. A connection to people who understood her. A connection to memories that still felt recent. To her parents, those visits probably seemed perfectly normal. Teenagers often fight to preserve friendships after moving away. They cling to familiar relationships because those relationships provide stability during periods of change. Nothing about Liberty's desire to visit Kerikeri appeared unusual. Nothing suggested danger. Nothing hinted at what was waiting in the future. In many ways, Liberty stood at a fascinating stage of life. She was old enough to begin imagining adulthood. Old enough to think about future careers, future relationships, and future adventures. Yet those dreams remained undefined. The future was still open. Still unwritten. That uncertainty is one of the most beautiful parts of being 15. Everything feels possible. You imagine years stretching endlessly ahead. You believe there will always be more time. More opportunities. More experiences. More tomorrows. Looking back now, that innocence feels almost painful. Because Liberty never got the chance to discover who she would become. She never got the opportunity to see adulthood unfold. She never got to experience the milestones that most people take for granted. No graduation. No career. No family of her own. No future beyond the age of 15. All of it was taken away before it had the chance to begin. The people who loved Liberty would later face one of the cruelest realities imaginable. The realization that every memory they possessed had suddenly become finite. There would be no new memories. Only old ones. Every photograph became more valuable. Every message became more meaningful. Every remembered conversation became something to preserve. When a young person dies unexpectedly, families often find themselves replaying ordinary moments over and over again. The last hug. The last phone call. The last smile. The last joke. At the time, none of those moments seem significant. Only afterward do they become priceless. For Liberty's family, that process would begin suddenly and brutally. One day she was alive. The next she was gone. Yet before the darkness arrived, before fear replaced hope, Liberty was simply enjoying what should have been an ordinary period of her life. She was reconnecting with friends. Adjusting to change. Experiencing the excitement and uncertainty of adolescence. She had reasons to look forward. Reasons to smile. Reasons to believe the future belonged to her. The tragedy of this case is not only that Liberty died. The tragedy is everything she never had the chance to experience. Every birthday that never arrived. Every dream that never became reality. Every chapter of life that remained unwritten. When investigators later examined her final hours, when journalists reconstructed timelines, and when lawyers debated evidence, there was a risk that Liberty could become reduced to a victim in a criminal case. But she was much more than that. She was a daughter who was loved. A friend who was remembered. A teenager whose life carried meaning far beyond the crime that ended it. That is why her story matters. Because behind every statistic is a person. Behind every headline is a family. And behind every true crime case is a life that once felt ordinary, hopeful, and full of possibility. As October 31, 2008, moved toward evening, Liberty Templeman was still living inside that possibility. She could not know that the hours ahead would become the most examined hours of her life. She could not know that investigators would someday reconstruct her movements minute by minute. She could not know that people across New Zealand would learn her name. She could not know that her story would become part of the nation's collective memory. She was simply a 15-year-old girl spending time with friends. A teenager looking forward to tomorrow. A young life still unfolding. And perhaps that is the most heartbreaking truth of all. Because while everyone around her saw endless years ahead, fate had already begun quietly counting down the final hours she had left. October 31, 2008, began as an ordinary spring day in Kerikeri. The sun rose over the green hills of Northland. Light filtered through orchards and across quiet residential streets. Families followed their usual routines. Shops opened their doors. Students enjoyed another day in a community where life generally moved at a slower pace than in New Zealand's major cities. For Liberty Templeman, the day carried no obvious sense of danger. She was 15 years old. She was back in Kerikeri visiting friends. And like countless teenagers around the world, she was focused on the simple things that mattered at that stage of life: friendships, plans, conversations, and the excitement of being surrounded by people she cared about. Nothing about the morning hinted at what would happen before the day was over. Nothing suggested that these would become the final hours of her life. As the afternoon progressed, Liberty spent time with friends in a social gathering that brought together several local teenagers. The atmosphere was casual. Young people talked, laughed, and enjoyed the freedom that often comes with adolescence. There were conversations that seemed important in the moment but would later be forgotten. There were jokes, stories, and plans for the evening ahead. Among the group was a 14-year-old boy named Theo Creel. At that point, he was simply another teenager within the social circle. A familiar face. Someone Liberty knew. Someone who attended the same school community. Someone who blended into the background of a normal day. No one present could have imagined that their names would eventually become permanently linked in one of New Zealand's most disturbing juvenile murder cases. As afternoon slowly turned toward evening, the sunlight softened across Kerikeri. The shadows grew longer. The temperature began to cool. The relaxed feeling of the day remained intact. Liberty appeared to be enjoying herself. Like many teenagers, she was balancing multiple plans and conversations at once. She had people to see. Messages to answer. A life that was moving forward. At approximately 6:30 p.m., Liberty left the gathering. She intended to meet her boyfriend, who was working at a local supermarket. It was not a dramatic departure. There was no scene. No visible conflict. No sign that she felt threatened. To those around her, it likely seemed like the most ordinary thing in the world. A teenager leaving one group of friends to meet someone else. The sort of decision that happens thousands of times every day. Nobody watching could have known they were witnessing the last confirmed moments before everything changed. As Liberty moved away from the group, evening settled more firmly across the town. Traffic remained light. The streets remained quiet. People continued with their lives, completely unaware that a tragedy was beginning to unfold. What happened next would become the subject of years of investigation, legal arguments, and public discussion. The precise sequence of events would be examined repeatedly. Every statement would be analyzed. Every detail would be scrutinized. Every inconsistency would be explored. But one fact remained clear. Liberty never reached her destination. The meeting she planned never happened. The person waiting for her never saw her arrive. Somewhere between leaving her friends and reaching the supermarket, something interrupted the future she expected to have. According to evidence later presented in court, Liberty remained in the company of Theo Creel during part of that evening. Exactly how the situation developed remains known only to those who were present. What investigators eventually pieced together was a disturbing chain of events that ended in violence. The prosecution would later argue that Liberty was attacked by someone she knew. Not by a stranger hiding in the shadows. Not by an unknown predator. But by another teenager from her own community. A teenager who was only 14 years old. At some point during the evening, the situation escalated. The details revealed during the trial painted a deeply disturbing picture. According to forensic evidence, Liberty suffered multiple blows to her head and face. These were not minor injuries. Medical experts later concluded that the force used was sufficient to render her unconscious. The attack transformed what had been an ordinary evening into a nightmare. Somewhere in the growing darkness, Liberty's ability to defend herself disappeared. The future she had imagined ended. The life she expected to continue was suddenly hanging by a thread. What makes these moments especially haunting is the silence surrounding them. No crowd witnessed the violence. No passerby intervened. No emergency call alerted authorities. The attack occurred beyond public view. While families across Kerikeri prepared dinner and settled into their evening routines, Liberty was fighting a battle nobody knew existed. The prosecution later argued that after the assault, Liberty was dragged across rough terrain. This conclusion was supported by injuries found on her body. Long abrasions on her back suggested movement over uneven ground while she was unable to protect herself. Each scrape told part of the story. Each injury represented another moment of suffering. Each mark became evidence of what happened after the violence began. Investigators would eventually reconstruct a sequence that grew darker with every discovery. After being assaulted, Liberty was allegedly moved toward a nearby stream. The location itself appeared deceptively peaceful. Water flowed quietly through an area surrounded by vegetation. In daylight, it would have looked unremarkable. The kind of place people pass without a second glance. But on that night, it became the setting for a crime that would shock the nation. According to prosecutors, Liberty was left face down in the water. At that point, she was either unconscious or incapable of protecting herself. The stream itself was not deep. That fact would later become one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the case. A person who is conscious and capable of movement could easily escape such water. But Liberty was not in a position to do so. The official cause of death would eventually be determined as drowning. The realization is chilling. Not because of the complexity of the method, but because of its simplicity. A young girl who should have had her entire life ahead of her died in a shallow stream because she was unable to save herself. Meanwhile, nobody knew she was missing. Not yet. At first, her absence may not have seemed alarming. Teenagers often change plans. They visit friends. They lose track of time. They forget to answer messages. Parents and friends usually assume there is an innocent explanation. But as the evening progressed, concern began to grow. Messages went unanswered. Communication stopped. The normal patterns people expected from Liberty suddenly disappeared. Those who knew her best recognized that something felt wrong. This wasn't typical behavior. This wasn't simply a teenager becoming distracted. The silence felt different. Unnatural. Disturbing. As night deepened across New Zealand's Northland region, worry slowly transformed into fear. Somewhere in Auckland, Liberty's family was beginning to sense that something wasn't right. A parent's intuition is difficult to explain. It often emerges before evidence exists. Before facts are available. Before logic can fully justify concern. Sometimes there is simply a feeling. A growing certainty that something is wrong. For Liberty's father, that feeling became impossible to ignore. As hours passed without contact, anxiety intensified. The situation no longer felt routine. The possibility of danger became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Eventually, concern drove action. A decision was made that would later reveal just how serious the situation had become. Liberty's father got into his vehicle and began the long drive from Auckland to Kerikeri. The journey covered hundreds of kilometers through the darkness. Road signs flashed past headlights. The night stretched endlessly ahead. Most parents who make such a drive are fueled by hope. Hope that their child simply lost a phone. Hope that there has been a misunderstanding. Hope that the situation will be resolved with a relieved conversation and an embarrassed apology. But fear travels alongside hope. And sometimes fear grows stronger with every passing mile. As Liberty's father drove north through the darkness, he could not know the truth waiting ahead. He could not know that the search for his daughter had already become something else. Because while loved ones were beginning to search, Liberty was no longer out there waiting to be found alive. The violence had already occurred. The damage had already been done. The final chapter of her life had already been written. Yet nobody knew it. Not her family. Not her friends. Not the community that would soon rally around her disappearance. The town of Kerikeri slept that night unaware of the tragedy hidden within its boundaries. Homes remained lit. Televisions glowed through curtains. Dogs barked in distant neighborhoods. People prepared for another ordinary weekend. But somewhere beyond those familiar scenes, in the darkness near a quiet stream, lay the answer to a mystery that had only just begun. By sunrise, fear would spread across the community. By the following day, a desperate search would be underway. And before another evening arrived, the hope that Liberty Templeman might still be alive would be destroyed forever. The ordinary day that began beneath a bright spring sky had transformed into something unimaginable. A teenager had vanished. A family had entered a nightmare. And a small New Zealand town was about to discover that evil can emerge in places where people least expect it. The horror of what happened to Liberty was no longer confined to a hidden corner of Kerikeri. It was moving toward the light. Toward discovery. Toward an investigation that would uncover a truth more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The morning of November 1st, 2008, arrived with a cruel contrast. The sun rose over Kerikeri just as it always did. Golden light spread across orchards and farmland. Birds moved through the trees. Residents opened curtains and began their day. At first glance, the town looked exactly the same as it had 24 hours earlier. But for Liberty Templeman's family, nothing was the same. By then, concern had already transformed into fear. The unanswered messages. The missed meeting. The complete absence of contact. Every passing hour had deepened the sense that something was terribly wrong. Somewhere between the previous evening and the dawn of a new day, the possibility that Liberty had simply changed plans became harder and harder to believe. Families know routines. They recognize patterns. And when those patterns suddenly disappear, alarm quickly follows. As word spread among friends and relatives, efforts to locate Liberty intensified. People began reaching out to one another. Questions circulated through social circles. Who had seen her last? Who had spoken to her? Where had she been planning to go? The answers were frustratingly incomplete. The timeline ended with uncertainty. The gap between what was known and what was unknown continued to grow. Throughout the community, concern spread rapidly. Kerikeri was not a large city where people could easily disappear into crowds. It was the kind of place where news traveled quickly. People talked. People noticed. People cared. The disappearance of a 15-year-old girl immediately captured attention. As volunteers and loved ones searched for answers, nobody yet understood the scale of the tragedy waiting to be uncovered. There was still hope. Hope can be remarkably stubborn. Even when evidence points toward danger, people cling to the possibility of a positive outcome. Perhaps she had gone somewhere unexpectedly. Perhaps there had been a misunderstanding. Perhaps she would walk through a door at any moment and explain everything. Those possibilities remained alive during the early hours of the search. But time was working against them. Every minute without contact felt heavier than the last. As investigators and members of the community worked to establish Liberty's movements, search efforts expanded into areas she might have visited. The focus naturally turned toward locations connected to her last known movements. Paths, roads, public spaces, areas where teenagers commonly gathered. People searched because they wanted answers. People searched because they wanted hope. And people searched because nobody wanted to imagine the alternative. Then came the discovery. The moment that changed everything. At some point during the search effort, attention turned toward an area near Yroa Stream, a relatively isolated location surrounded by vegetation and an abandoned orchard. In daylight, the area appeared quiet. Almost peaceful. The stream wound its way through the landscape with little indication of the horror hidden nearby. Nature has a strange ability to remain indifferent to human suffering. The water continued flowing. The trees continued swaying. The world continued moving forward. But beneath that appearance of calm lay the evidence of a violent crime. When Liberty was found, hope ended instantly. There would be no reunion. No explanation. No relief. Only devastation. The 15-year-old girl who had vanished the previous evening was dead. The discovery sent shockwaves through everyone involved. Search efforts immediately transformed into a homicide investigation. Family members who had spent hours praying for good news suddenly faced a reality almost impossible to comprehend. Friends who had expected answers were confronted with unimaginable loss. And a community that had spent the morning hoping for a happy ending found itself mourning a child. The location itself became one of the most important crime scenes in modern New Zealand criminal history. Investigators quickly secured the area. What had initially been a search zone was now a forensic scene. Every footprint mattered. Every broken branch mattered. Every piece of physical evidence mattered. The task facing detectives was enormous. They needed to determine not only who had killed Liberty, but exactly what had happened during her final hours. The first observations were deeply troubling. Liberty's body showed signs of violence. Bruising was visible. Her clothing was disturbed. Some reports described her as partially unclothed. Almost immediately, investigators recognized that this was not a simple accident. The scene suggested something far darker. At first glance, several possibilities emerged. Had Liberty been sexually assaulted? Had she been attacked by a stranger? Had she encountered someone she knew? Every theory remained open. Every possibility required investigation. Experienced detectives understand that first impressions can be misleading. Crime scenes often tell incomplete stories. Sometimes evidence points in the wrong direction. Sometimes offenders deliberately manipulate a scene to create confusion. The challenge is separating appearance from reality. As forensic specialists began their examination, they documented every detail with painstaking precision. Photographs captured the scene exactly as it was found. Measurements were taken. Evidence markers appeared throughout the area. Investigators moved slowly and carefully, understanding that the smallest overlooked detail could later prove crucial. The stream itself became a focal point. At first glance, its shallow water seemed incapable of causing such devastation. Yet appearances can be deceptive. Medical experts would later determine that drowning was the official cause of death. That conclusion introduced a chilling possibility. Liberty may have entered the water while unable to protect herself. Unable to stand. Unable to escape. Unable to survive. The implications were horrifying. As the forensic examination continued, investigators began identifying additional signs of violence. The injuries on Liberty's body did not support a simple accidental fall. There were indications of blunt force trauma. Injuries to the head and face. Evidence suggesting a struggle had occurred before death. The more detectives learned, the more obvious it became that they were dealing with a homicide. Then came another disturbing observation. Marks on Liberty's body suggested movement after the initial assault. Long abrasions indicated that she had likely been dragged across rough ground. These injuries became critically important. They helped investigators begin reconstructing the sequence of events. Someone had not merely attacked Liberty. Someone had moved her. Someone had taken deliberate actions after the violence occurred. Every new piece of evidence raised the stakes. Every discovery narrowed the range of possible explanations. The emerging picture was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. This was not a spontaneous accident beside a stream. This was a crime scene. And somewhere in Kerikeri, the person responsible was still free. News of the discovery spread rapidly. For residents, the emotional impact was immediate. Many had followed the search from the beginning. Many knew Liberty personally. Others knew her family. Some had children attending the same schools. The realization that a teenager had been murdered within their community shattered assumptions about safety. Parents began asking difficult questions. How could this happen here? Who would do such a thing? Was the killer a stranger? Or someone already known to the community? Fear thrives in uncertainty. And at that moment, uncertainty dominated everything. The crime scene provided clues, but not yet answers. Investigators knew they needed to reconstruct Liberty's final hours with precision. Who had she been with? Who had spoken to her last? Who could account for their movements? The answers to those questions would determine the direction of the investigation. Meanwhile, forensic specialists continued processing evidence. Every item recovered from the scene carried potential significance. Fibers. Footwear impressions. Personal belongings. Biological evidence. Nothing could be ignored. Nothing could be dismissed. Somewhere within the collection of physical evidence was the story of what happened. The challenge was learning how to read it. As investigators examined the scene, they also began gathering witness statements. Teenagers who had attended the earlier gathering were interviewed. Friends were questioned. Timelines were constructed. Movements were documented. The final known hours of Liberty's life slowly began taking shape. And within that timeline, certain names started appearing repeatedly. Certain individuals occupied positions closer to the center of the investigation than others. At that stage, detectives remained cautious. Good investigators do not rush to conclusions. They follow evidence. They test assumptions. They verify facts. But even in the earliest stages, some details stood out. Some statements seemed particularly important. Some individuals possessed information that demanded closer scrutiny. The path toward identifying a suspect had already begun. No one outside the investigation fully understood it yet. But the wheels were turning. The discovery of Liberty's body marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The search was over. The investigation had begun. From that moment forward, every piece of evidence would be examined through a different lens. No longer were authorities looking for a missing teenager. They were hunting a killer. A killer who, according to everything known so far, might not have been a stranger lurking outside the community. The evidence suggested something far more unsettling. The possibility that Liberty's final moments involved someone she already knew. Someone familiar. Someone trusted. Someone who had moved through the same streets, attended the same schools, and lived among the same neighbors. That possibility transformed fear into something even darker. Because if the killer truly came from within the community, then the danger was not hidden somewhere beyond Kerikeri. It was already there. Standing among them. Waiting to be identified. The discovery of Liberty Templeman's body transformed a missing person search into a murder investigation almost overnight. What had begun as a desperate effort to locate a 15-year-old girl now became a race against time to identify the person responsible for her death. For detectives, the first days after a homicide are often the most critical. Memories are fresh. Witnesses are easier to locate. Physical evidence remains intact. Every hour matters. And in a town the size of Kerikeri, investigators understood something else. The answer was likely close. Very close. The challenge was determining exactly where to look. As officers began reconstructing Liberty's final known movements, they quickly focused on the hours between her departure from the gathering of friends and the moment she disappeared. Those missing hours contained the key to the entire case. Someone had seen her. Someone had spoken with her. Someone knew more than they were saying. The question was who? Interviews began almost immediately. Friends were questioned. Classmates were questioned. Anyone who had interacted with Liberty during her final day became part of the investigation. Detectives worked methodically, creating timelines and comparing statements. At first, the process resembled assembling a puzzle with hundreds of missing pieces. Different witnesses remembered different details. Some remembered seeing Liberty at one point during the afternoon. Others remembered conversations that seemed insignificant at the time. Investigators collected everything. Even the smallest detail could eventually become important. One name appeared repeatedly throughout those early interviews. Theo Creel. The 14-year-old had been present during the gathering where Liberty spent part of her final afternoon. Like many of the teenagers involved, he knew her. They attended the same school community. Their social circles overlapped. Nothing about that fact was unusual. In a town like Kerikeri, most young people knew one another to some degree. At first, Theo was simply another witness. Another teenager who might help detectives understand Liberty's final movements. Another source of information. Nothing more. When questioned about Liberty's disappearance, Theo reportedly told people that he had last seen her near Kerikeri High School and that she had been fine when they parted ways. On the surface, the statement sounded straightforward. Simple. Reasonable. The type of answer investigators hear every day. Yet experienced detectives know that witness statements are only one piece of a much larger picture. Statements must be compared against evidence. Timelines must be tested. Facts must be verified. As investigators continued their work, they noticed something that initially appeared almost reassuring. Theo had participated in efforts to locate Liberty. Like many others in the community, he joined the search after news of her disappearance spread. To most people, that behavior would seem perfectly natural. A local teenager helping look for a missing friend. A concerned member of the community wanting answers. But in criminal investigations, context changes everything. Actions that appear innocent can later take on a completely different meaning. At the time, no one outside the investigation knew whether Theo's participation in the search meant anything at all. Perhaps it was exactly what it appeared to be. Perhaps it wasn't. Detectives kept gathering evidence. While witness interviews continued, forensic specialists focused on the physical evidence recovered near the stream. The crime scene had already revealed signs of violence. Now investigators needed to identify the person connected to that violence. Every recovered item became important. Every trace mattered. The examination extended beyond the immediate scene. Searches began targeting locations that could potentially contain additional evidence. The strategy was simple. If the offender had attempted to conceal what happened, there was a strong possibility that physical evidence existed elsewhere. Criminals often make mistakes after committing violent acts. They panic. They overlook details. They dispose of items carelessly. They believe they have hidden evidence when they have actually left investigators a trail. The question was whether such a trail existed in this case. Gradually, investigators began finding answers. Among the most significant discoveries was clothing linked to Liberty. A blood-stained garment was recovered from bushes near Theo Creel's home. The discovery immediately attracted attention. This was not a random piece of evidence. This was an item connected directly to the victim. Its location raised difficult questions. How had it ended up there? Who had placed it there? And why? For investigators, the significance was obvious. Physical evidence often speaks more honestly than people do. Unlike witnesses, evidence cannot forget. Unlike suspects, evidence cannot lie. It simply exists. The challenge is understanding what it means. The clothing was not the only item recovered. Investigators also located beads from Liberty's necklace and other personal items associated with the attack. Taken individually, each discovery represented a fragment of the story. Together, they began forming a much larger picture. A picture that increasingly pointed detectives in a specific direction. As the investigation progressed, attention focused more intensely on Theo. That did not mean detectives immediately viewed him as the killer. Good investigations require caution. Assumptions can be dangerous. Evidence must lead the process. But evidence was beginning to accumulate. And the evidence was difficult to ignore. Meanwhile, interviews continued. As often happens in homicide investigations, investigators revisited witnesses multiple times. Statements were compared against one another. Timelines were refined. Details were tested. The goal was consistency. Truth tends to remain stable. Fabrications often do not. The more investigators examined various accounts, the more certain inconsistencies emerged. Some explanations failed to align with forensic findings. Some details appeared incomplete. Some versions of events changed over time. For detectives, changing stories can be an important warning sign. People may forget minor details. That is normal. But significant changes to critical events often demand closer scrutiny. The investigation entered a new phase. No longer were detectives simply trying to determine what happened. They were beginning to understand who might be responsible. Yet important questions remained unanswered. What had triggered the violence? Was the attack planned? Had it escalated suddenly from another situation? What exactly occurred during Liberty's final moments? The evidence suggested a brutal assault. Medical examinations revealed multiple injuries to Liberty's head and face. Experts concluded that the force used was sufficient to render her unconscious. Those findings carried enormous significance. They challenged any suggestion that Liberty had simply fallen accidentally into the stream. The injuries were too extensive, too deliberate, too severe. Forensic evidence also supported the conclusion that Liberty had been dragged across the ground. The abrasions on her body were difficult to explain any other way. Again, investigators returned to the same question. Who would do this? And why? The case became increasingly disturbing not merely because of the violence itself, but because of the ages involved. The victim was 15. The emerging suspect was 14. For many people following the investigation, that reality felt almost impossible to process. Society expects violence from hardened criminals. Society understands the concept of dangerous adults. But the idea that such a crime could involve children challenged deeply held assumptions. Parents throughout New Zealand watched developments closely. Many struggled to comprehend how a teenager could become involved in an act of such brutality. The investigation continued moving forward. Piece by piece. Fact by fact. Evidence by evidence. The circle around Theo tightened. Each new discovery appeared to reinforce concerns already developing within the investigative team. By this stage, detectives were no longer dealing with vague suspicions. They possessed physical evidence. They possessed witness statements. They possessed forensic findings. And increasingly, all three appeared to be pointing in the same direction. Yet even then, investigators needed more. Homicide cases are built through accumulation. One piece of evidence is rarely enough. A successful prosecution requires a complete narrative supported by facts. Detectives worked relentlessly to establish that narrative. The final movements. The attack. The transportation of the victim. The concealment efforts. Every element needed to be understood. Every element needed evidence behind it. As the days passed, the atmosphere in Kerikeri changed dramatically. The initial shock of Liberty's death remained, but now it was accompanied by something else. Suspicion. Rumors circulated. Speculation spread through schools, neighborhoods, and workplaces. People wanted answers. People wanted certainty. Most importantly, people wanted justice. Yet investigators understood that justice requires patience. Cases built too quickly can collapse. Cases built carefully can survive scrutiny. So they continued following the evidence wherever it led. And increasingly, it led toward a conclusion that would stun the community. The possibility that the person responsible for Liberty Templeman's death was not a stranger. Not an outsider. Not an unknown predator passing through town. But a local teenager. A boy many people recognized. A boy who had stood among volunteers during the search. A boy who had looked into the eyes of grieving friends and family while claiming to help find the missing girl. The implications were chilling. Because if investigators were right, then one of the most haunting aspects of the case was not the violence itself. It was what happened afterward. The ability to return to normal life. The ability to blend into the crowd. The ability to stand beside people desperately searching for answers while already knowing the truth. By the time detectives reached this stage of the investigation, they were approaching a critical turning point. The pieces were beginning to align. The evidence was beginning to speak. And soon, a breakthrough would emerge that would transform suspicion into formal accusation and set the stage for one of the most closely watched murder trials in modern New Zealand history. By the time investigators entered the next phase of the Liberty Templeman case, the atmosphere in Kerikeri had changed completely. The shock that followed the discovery of her body had evolved into something darker. People were no longer asking whether a crime had occurred. They were asking who had done it. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same subject. Parents discussed the case at kitchen tables. Students whispered about it in school hallways. Shop owners talked about it behind counters. The entire community was searching for answers. Yet while rumors spread through the town, detectives remained focused on evidence. They knew that speculation solves nothing. Only facts matter. And increasingly, the facts were leading investigators toward a conclusion that many people would struggle to accept. The breakthrough did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. There was no sudden confession. No eyewitness stepping forward at the last minute. No piece of evidence magically solving the entire case. Instead, the breakthrough emerged the way most real homicide breakthroughs do. Slowly. Patiently. Piece by piece. Every recovered item. Every forensic result. Every interview. Every contradiction. Together they began creating a picture that became harder and harder to ignore. Detectives had already identified Theo Creel as someone who occupied a significant position within Liberty's final known timeline. He had been with her on the day she disappeared. He had spoken about seeing her. He had provided explanations regarding their last interaction. And physical evidence connected the investigation increasingly closer to him. Still, investigators needed more than suspicion. They needed certainty. The challenge was proving exactly what had happened during those missing hours. One of the most important developments came from forensic analysis. Unlike witness testimony, forensic evidence is indifferent to emotion. It does not care about public opinion. It does not change its story. It simply reveals what occurred. And the forensic findings in Liberty's case created enormous problems for anyone attempting to explain her death as an accident. Medical experts documented injuries that could not easily be dismissed. The trauma to her head and face indicated significant violence. These were not superficial injuries. These were injuries consistent with a serious assault. The prosecution would later argue that the force used was sufficient to render Liberty unconscious. That conclusion became critical. Because if Liberty was unconscious before entering the stream, then the entire narrative surrounding her death changed. An accidental drowning suddenly became much less plausible. An unconscious victim cannot protect herself. Cannot stand. Cannot react. Cannot escape. The stream that took her life was not deep. That fact haunted investigators. A healthy teenager could have easily survived. An unconscious one could not. As forensic specialists continued their analysis, another important finding gained attention. The abrasions found on Liberty's body. Long marks and injuries suggested movement across rough terrain. Investigators believed these injuries were consistent with dragging. The implication was chilling. After the violence occurred, somebody had moved Liberty. Somebody had taken deliberate action. Somebody had made choices after the assault. Those choices became a crucial part of the investigation. Because they suggested consciousness of guilt. They suggested an effort to conceal what had happened. They suggested something far beyond a simple accident. The more evidence investigators collected, the more difficult it became to reconcile the physical facts with innocent explanations. Then came the issue of the clothing. During the investigation, authorities recovered items linked directly to Liberty. Among them was a blood-stained garment found concealed near Theo Creel's home. The discovery represented a major turning point. Physical evidence is powerful because it creates connections. It links people to places. Places to events. Events to timelines. The location of the garment immediately raised serious questions. Investigators wanted to know why evidence connected to the victim would be found there. The answer mattered. Because the discovery strengthened a growing theory that someone had attempted to hide incriminating material after the crime. Additional items recovered during the investigation further reinforced that theory. Beads from Liberty's necklace. Personal effects. Objects connected to the attack. Each item represented another fragment of the truth. Individually, they were important. Collectively, they became overwhelming. Meanwhile, detectives continued interviewing Theo. Like many homicide investigations, the process involved multiple conversations over time. Investigators compared statements, checked timelines, measured explanations against forensic evidence. And as that process unfolded, a troubling pattern emerged. Theo's account of events was not always consistent. Details changed. Explanations evolved. Different versions of the story appeared at different stages. For experienced investigators, inconsistencies often become extremely significant. The truth tends to remain stable. People may forget minor details, but major events usually remain remarkably consistent. When critical aspects of a story begin shifting, detectives pay attention. Very close attention. According to evidence later discussed in court, Theo offered varying explanations regarding what had happened between him and Liberty. At one point, he claimed she had fallen accidentally into the stream. The explanation attempted to portray the tragedy as an unintended event. An accident. A horrible misunderstanding. But investigators faced a problem. The forensic evidence did not support that version of events. The injuries were too extensive. The physical findings too specific. The circumstances too suspicious. Every time detectives compared the explanation against the evidence, new questions emerged. How did the injuries occur? Why were there signs of dragging? How did items connected to Liberty end up hidden? Why did the physical evidence tell a different story? The answers increasingly pointed in one direction. As pressure mounted, investigators continued assembling their case. What they were building was not based on a single piece of evidence. It was based on accumulation. A network of facts supporting one another. The timeline. The forensic findings. The recovered items. The changing statements. The circumstances surrounding Liberty's disappearance. Together they created a powerful narrative. One that detectives believed explained what happened. As that narrative became clearer, the focus shifted from determining whether Theo was involved to determining how prosecutors would eventually present the case. The investigation had reached its defining moment. The evidence had crossed an invisible threshold. Suspicion was becoming accusation. Theory was becoming prosecution. The breakthrough investigators had been searching for was finally taking shape. It was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was something more powerful. Evidence. Evidence strong enough to support criminal charges. Evidence strong enough to place a 14-year-old boy at the center of a murder case. For the community, the implications were staggering. Many people struggled to comprehend what investigators were alleging. A teenager. A child, legally speaking. Accused of killing another child. The case challenged assumptions about violence, responsibility, and human behavior. People wanted a simple explanation. But simple explanations rarely exist in homicide investigations. Reality is often uncomfortable, complicated, disturbing. The Liberty Templeman case was no exception. As detectives finalized their findings, attention increasingly turned toward the future. The investigation itself was approaching completion. The next battle would occur elsewhere. Not at the crime scene. Not in interview rooms. But inside a courtroom. There, prosecutors would need to convince a jury that the evidence proved murder. Defense attorneys would challenge those conclusions. Experts would testify. Witnesses would be questioned. Every detail would face scrutiny. Every assumption would be tested. The stakes could not have been higher. Because at the center of the case stood two families whose lives had already been permanently altered. One family mourning a daughter they would never see again. Another family confronting allegations almost impossible to imagine. As investigators prepared their evidence for court, they understood that the breakthrough had done more than identify a suspect. It had uncovered a deeply unsettling story. A story involving violence. A story involving concealment. A story involving two teenagers whose lives became forever linked on a spring evening in Kerikeri. For Liberty's loved ones, however, the breakthrough carried a different meaning. It represented hope. Not the hope that Liberty would return. That possibility had vanished long ago. Instead, it represented hope for answers. Hope for accountability. Hope that the truth, however painful, would eventually emerge. And soon, that truth would be tested in front of a jury. Every piece of evidence. Every forensic finding. Every contradiction. Every unanswered question. All of it would converge inside a courtroom where the future of the case would finally be decided. The investigation had revealed its suspect. Now justice would have to determine whether the evidence revealed a killer. By the time the Liberty Templeman murder case reached the courtroom, more than a year had passed since the spring evening that changed so many lives forever. For Liberty's family, every day of that year had carried the weight of loss. Birthdays had passed without her. Family gatherings had included an empty space. Photographs had become painful reminders of a future that would never exist. While investigators spent months assembling evidence and prosecutors prepared their case, Liberty's loved ones were forced to confront a reality that never became easier. She was gone. And nothing the justice system could do would bring her back. Yet despite that painful truth, the trial mattered. It mattered because the courtroom represented the final opportunity to answer the question that had haunted the community from the beginning. What happened to Liberty Templeman? Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere reflected the gravity of the case. This was not merely another criminal proceeding. This was one of the most shocking juvenile murder cases New Zealand had seen in years. The victim had been 15. The accused had been 14. Even before testimony began, those ages cast a shadow over everything. People naturally associate murder trials with adults. The presence of two teenagers at the center of such a horrific case challenged assumptions and forced difficult conversations about violence, responsibility, and accountability. For the jurors selected to hear the case, the responsibility was enormous. They would be asked to examine evidence that was often disturbing. They would hear descriptions of violence. They would study forensic findings. Most importantly, they would decide whether the prosecution had proven murder beyond reasonable doubt. The trial itself became a battle between two very different interpretations of Liberty's final hours. The prosecution argued that the evidence revealed a deliberate and violent sequence of events. According to their case, Liberty had been assaulted, rendered unconscious, and left face down in the stream where she drowned. The physical evidence, prosecutors argued, painted a clear picture. The injuries to Liberty's head and face were not consistent with a simple accident. The abrasions on her body suggested she had been dragged. The disturbed clothing raised additional concerns regarding events before her death. And the efforts to conceal evidence pointed toward consciousness of guilt. Taken together, prosecutors argued, these facts supported only one conclusion: murder. The defense presented a very different narrative. Their challenge was not simple. The physical evidence created significant obstacles. Nevertheless, they sought to raise doubt regarding the prosecution's interpretation. At various points, Theo Creel's explanations included suggestions that Liberty's death resulted from an accident near the stream. The defense attempted to challenge the certainty of the prosecution's reconstruction of events. If doubt existed, they argued, the jury had a responsibility to consider it. As testimony unfolded, jurors were exposed to the painful details of Liberty's final hours. Forensic experts played a crucial role. Medical evidence often carries tremendous weight in homicide trials because it provides objective insight into what occurred. The experts described the injuries found on Liberty's body. They explained the significance of the trauma. They discussed the conclusions reached during the post-mortem examination. Their testimony reinforced many of the findings that had shaped the investigation from the beginning. The injuries were serious. The injuries were numerous. And the injuries did not align comfortably with the theory of a simple accident. Particularly important was the issue of consciousness. Medical experts explained why the injuries suggested Liberty may have been incapacitated before entering the stream. That conclusion carried enormous implications. An unconscious victim is vulnerable. An unconscious victim cannot protect herself. An unconscious victim placed face down in water faces obvious danger. The prosecution returned repeatedly to that point. They argued that the stream itself was not what made the situation fatal. Rather, it was Liberty's condition before entering the water. The evidence, they said, showed that condition resulted directly from the assault. Jurors also heard about the physical evidence recovered during the investigation. Items connected to Liberty. Evidence discovered near Theo's residence. Objects linked to the events surrounding her death. Each piece added another layer to the prosecution's case. Individually, the items may not have seemed decisive. Together, however, they formed a broader pattern. A pattern prosecutors believed pointed directly toward guilt. One of the most closely watched aspects of the trial involved Theo's various explanations. As investigators had discovered during the case, different versions of events emerged at different times. Jurors were asked to consider these inconsistencies carefully. Why had certain details changed? Why did some explanations conflict with physical evidence? Why did some accounts evolve as the investigation progressed? The prosecution argued that innocent people generally have no need to continually revise the truth. The changing stories, they suggested, reflected attempts to explain evidence that could not otherwise be reconciled. The defense naturally disagreed. Human memory is imperfect. Traumatic situations affect recollection. Teenagers, particularly those facing extraordinary pressure, may not always express themselves consistently. The jury ultimately had to determine which interpretation was more convincing. As the trial continued, emotions remained high. Every witness carried a piece of the story. Every day brought another painful reminder of what had happened. For Liberty's family, sitting through testimony required immense strength. Listening to forensic details about a loved one's death is among the most difficult experiences imaginable. Each photograph, each description, each piece of evidence, all of it forced them to relive the tragedy again and again. Yet they remained there, waiting, listening, hoping that the process would eventually deliver answers. Outside the courtroom, public interest remained intense. News organizations followed developments closely. Communities across New Zealand paid attention. The case had evolved into more than a local tragedy. It had become a national story. Partly because of its brutality. Partly because of the ages involved. and partly because people struggled to comprehend how such violence could emerge from within a seemingly ordinary teenage social environment. As the proceedings neared their conclusion, both sides delivered their final arguments. The prosecution urged jurors to focus on the totality of the evidence. Not one fact. Not one witness. Not one injury. All of it together. The physical evidence. The forensic findings. The concealed items. The inconsistencies. The circumstances surrounding Liberty's death. They argued that when viewed collectively, the evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward guilt. The defense asked jurors to remain cautious. To remember the burden of proof. To avoid assumptions. To consider whether unanswered questions still existed. The fate of the case now rested entirely in the hands of 12 ordinary citizens. The jury withdrew to deliberate. For Liberty's family, the waiting must have felt unbearable. Months of investigation. Years of grief. Weeks of testimony. All leading to a single decision. The verdict. Deliberations lasted approximately 10 hours. Then the jury returned. Inside the courtroom, tension was overwhelming. Every person present understood the significance of the moment. The silence before a verdict is unlike any other silence. Lives hang in the balance. Families hold their breath. Entire futures can change within seconds. When the verdict was announced, the jury found Theo Creel guilty of murder. The decision was not unanimous, but it was sufficient. The vote stood at 11-1. He was also convicted of sexual violation. For Liberty's family, the verdict likely produced conflicting emotions. Relief that accountability had been achieved. Pain because the outcome could never restore what had been lost. Validation that investigators had uncovered the truth. Sorrow because the truth itself was devastating. The legal process, however, was not yet complete. Sentencing remained. Weeks later, the court reconvened. This stage focused not on guilt but on punishment. The judge reviewed the evidence, the circumstances of the crime, and the actions that followed Liberty's death. Particularly significant were the efforts to conceal evidence and mislead investigators. The court viewed those actions as aggravating factors. They suggested awareness, intent, an understanding of wrongdoing. When sentencing was finally delivered, Theo Creel received life imprisonment. The court imposed a minimum non-parole period of 11.5 years. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the crime while also acknowledging the unusual reality that the offender had been only 14 years old at the time of the murder. For many observers, the sentence closed the legal chapter of the case. The investigation was over. The trial was over. The verdict had been delivered. Justice, at least in the legal sense, had been achieved. Yet justice is a complicated concept. A conviction can punish an offender. A sentence can hold someone accountable. But neither can reverse tragedy. Neither can restore stolen years. Neither can return a daughter to her family. As people left the courtroom and the headlines gradually faded, one truth remained unchanged. A 15-year-old girl named Liberty Templeman was still gone. The verdict explained who was responsible. The sentence imposed consequences. But the loss itself remained permanent. And for everyone touched by the case, that reality would continue long after the courtroom lights dimmed and the legal proceedings became history. When a true crime story reaches its verdict, there is often a temptation to view that moment as the ending. The jury speaks. The judge delivers a sentence. The courtroom empties. The headlines begin to fade. And from a distance, it can seem as though the story is complete. But for the people who actually lived through the tragedy, that is rarely how it feels. For them, the verdict is not the end. It is simply the point at which the world stops paying attention. The aftermath is where the real struggle begins. For Liberty Templeman's family, no court ruling could restore what had been taken from them. No sentence, regardless of its length, could recreate the future that disappeared on October 31, 2008. The legal system had answered the question of responsibility. It had identified the person accountable for Liberty's death. It had imposed punishment. Yet grief operates according to its own rules. It does not disappear because a verdict has been reached. It does not soften because a judge has spoken. It remains. Sometimes quietly. Sometimes overwhelmingly. Always present. Somewhere in family photo albums, Liberty remained 15 years old. She would never grow older. She would never graduate. She would never begin a career. She would never experience the milestones that most people move through without a second thought. There would be no wedding photographs. No future children. No decades of memories waiting to be created. Her life had stopped while everyone else's continued forward. That reality represents one of the cruelest aspects of homicide. The victim remains frozen in time. Everyone who loved them must continue living in a world where they no longer exist. As years passed, Liberty's family carried that burden. Like countless families affected by violent crime, they faced a future divided into two parts. Life before the tragedy. And life after it. The boundary between those two worlds could never be erased. The case also left a lasting impact on Kerikeri itself. Small communities often define themselves through shared experiences. Most of those experiences are positive. Celebrations. Achievements. Local traditions. Moments of collective pride. But occasionally a community becomes connected through tragedy. The murder of Liberty Templeman became one of those defining moments. Residents who lived through those events would remember exactly where they were when they learned a local teenager had disappeared. They would remember the search. They would remember the discovery. They would remember the fear. And they would remember the shock that followed when investigators identified another teenager as the offender. The case shattered assumptions many people held about safety. Before Liberty's death, violent crime felt distant to many residents. Something that happened elsewhere. Something that belonged to larger cities or unfamiliar places. The tragedy forced people to confront a difficult truth. Violence is not limited by geography. It does not respect the boundaries of quiet towns. It does not avoid close-knit communities. Sometimes the most devastating crimes occur in places where people feel safest. That realization changed the way many people viewed their world. Parents became more cautious. Communities became more aware. Conversations about youth violence, vulnerability, and safety took on greater urgency. Yet perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case was not where it happened. It was who was involved. Even years later, people continued struggling with the same haunting question. How could two teenagers become connected through such a horrific act? The victim was 15. The offender was 14. Those ages remain difficult to process. Society often imagines violence as something committed by adults. People with long criminal histories. People hardened by years of bad decisions. The Liberty Templeman case challenged those assumptions. It forced people to confront uncomfortable realities about youth violence and human behavior. It reminded everyone that age alone does not guarantee innocence. At the same time, the case raised difficult questions about intervention and prevention. Were there warning signs? Could anything have changed the outcome? Were there opportunities to prevent the tragedy before it occurred? These questions emerge after nearly every violent crime. Sometimes answers exist. Sometimes they do not. Human beings naturally search for explanations because explanations create the illusion of control. If we can identify exactly why something happened, we can believe it will never happen again. Reality is rarely that simple. Some tragedies resist easy explanations. The Liberty Templeman case remains one of them. Investigators reconstructed events. Forensic experts analyzed evidence. The courts delivered a verdict. Yet understanding what happened is not the same as understanding why. The deepest motivations often remain hidden. Locked inside the minds of those involved. Beyond the reach of forensic science. Beyond the reach of courtrooms. Beyond the reach of certainty. Perhaps that uncertainty explains why the case continues to resonate years later. People are not only interested in the facts, they are searching for meaning, searching for lessons, searching for ways to understand how a seemingly ordinary day transformed into an irreversible nightmare. One lesson stands out above all others. Life is fragile. Far more fragile than most people realize. On the afternoon of October 31st, 2008, Liberty Templeman was doing what countless teenagers do every day. Spending time with friends. Making plans. Thinking about tomorrow. There was no indication that her future would end before sunrise. Yet within hours, everything changed. The ordinary became extraordinary. The routine became tragic. The future disappeared. That transformation happened with terrifying speed. And it serves as a reminder that the moments we often overlook can become the moments we later cherish most. A conversation. A hug. A text message. A goodbye. At the time, they seem insignificant. Only later do we understand their value. For many people who follow true crime stories, it is easy to become focused on offenders. The investigations. The courtroom battles. The forensic evidence. The psychology of violence. Those elements are fascinating. But they should never become the center of the story. The center of this story is Liberty. A young girl whose life mattered. A daughter who was loved. A friend who was missed. A teenager whose future should have stretched far beyond 15 years. When people remember her case, that is what deserves to endure. Not merely the crime. Not merely the offender. But the life that was lost. Because true crime, at its best, is not about celebrating darkness. It is about acknowledging its consequences. It is about remembering victims as people rather than statistics. It is about understanding that behind every case file exists a family forever changed. The Liberty Templeman case leaves us with uncomfortable truths. It reminds us that danger can emerge from familiar places. It reminds us that appearances can be deceptive. It reminds us that violence often creates far more victims than those named in court documents. Families suffer. Friends suffer. Communities suffer. The damage spreads outward in ways that cannot be measured. And yet, despite that darkness, there is another truth worth remembering. Human beings continue forward. Communities heal. Families find ways to carry their grief. Memories survive. Love survives. The people we lose never completely disappear as long as they remain remembered. Today, years after the events that shocked Kerikeri and captured the attention of New Zealand, Liberty Templeman's story still endures. Not because of the violence that ended her life, but because her life itself mattered. The tragedy of her death is undeniable. The sadness remains. The unanswered emotional questions remain. Yet beyond all of that exists the simple reality that she was here. She lived. She laughed. She loved. She dreamed. And although her story ended far too soon, the memory of who she was continues long after the headlines vanished. Perhaps that is the final lesson hidden within this case. Justice can punish wrongdoing. Courts can establish accountability. Investigators can uncover the truth. But remembrance is something different. Remembrance is how we ensure that victims remain more than names in forgotten files. It is how we acknowledge the value of lives cut short. And it is how we honor the people whose stories deserve to be told. Liberty Templeman was one of those people. A 15-year-old girl who should have had decades ahead of her. A daughter whose absence continues to be felt. A life interrupted. A future stolen. And a reminder that behind every true crime case lies something infinitely more important than the crime itself. A human life. One that deserved far more time than it was given. Here is part 10, written as a concluding epilogue chapter in the same narrative style. Years have passed since the death of Liberty Templeman, yet certain stories never truly fade. Some crimes disappear into archives. They become case numbers. Old newspaper clippings. Forgotten court records stored in boxes and databases. But some cases remain alive in public memory because they touch something deeper than curiosity. They force people to confront uncomfortable truths about humanity. The Kerikeri killing became one of those cases. Not because it involved the highest number of victims. Not because it was the most complex investigation in New Zealand history. But because it shattered an illusion. The illusion that youth automatically equals innocence. The illusion that tragedy only arrives from outside a community. The illusion that violence always announces itself before it strikes. For many people who followed the case, the details remain haunting even today. A 15-year-old girl visiting friends. A normal spring evening. A short walk. A destination only minutes away. Then silence. The timeline is frightening precisely because it feels so ordinary. There was no dramatic warning. No obvious danger visible from a distance. No indication that one decision, one encounter, and one series of moments would end in irreversible tragedy. That reality continues to resonate because it reflects the randomness that often accompanies real-life violence. People want clear signs. Clear warnings. Clear villains. Reality rarely provides them. Looking back now, it is easy to focus entirely on the crime itself. The assault. The investigation. The trial. The verdict. Yet doing so risks overlooking something important. Liberty's story did not begin with her death. And it should not be remembered only because of the way it ended. Long before investigators arrived at a stream. Long before forensic experts examined evidence. Long before lawyers stood before a jury. There was simply a young girl living her life. A daughter growing up far from the country where she was born. A teenager building friendships. A young person trying to find her place in the world. When violent crime occurs, victims often become frozen at the moment of their death. Their identities become permanently connected to tragedy. But the people who loved liberty remember something different. They remember birthdays. Conversations. Laughter. Family moments. The ordinary memories that never appear in court transcripts. Those memories matter because they restore humanity to a story that could otherwise become consumed by darkness. The passage of time changes many things. Witnesses grow older. Communities change. Buildings disappear. New generations emerge. Yet grief possesses a unique relationship with time. It evolves. It adapts. But it never completely leaves. Families who lose loved ones often describe grief as something carried rather than something overcome. At first the weight feels impossible. Every day requires effort. Every memory hurts. Every reminder creates fresh pain. Gradually, people learn how to live alongside that weight. The burden becomes familiar. But it never truly disappears. For Liberty's family, life continued after the trial because life always continues. Days became months. Months became years. New experiences arrived. New challenges appeared. Yet somewhere within all those years remained the absence of a 15-year-old girl who never had the chance to grow older. There is a particular cruelty in the loss of young people. When an elderly person dies, grief often centers around what has been lost. When a teenager dies, grief frequently centers around what will never exist. The future becomes part of the tragedy. The graduation that never happened. The career that never began. The family that never formed. The decades that vanished before they had the opportunity to unfold. Liberty's case serves as a reminder of that reality. Not merely a life ended, but a future erased. The case also remains significant because it challenged assumptions about adolescent violence. Many people prefer simple explanations. They want to believe violent offenders are fundamentally different from everyone else. Easy to identify. Easy to predict. Easy to separate from society. The Liberty Templeman case demonstrated that reality is often more complicated. Human behavior exists on a spectrum that cannot always be understood through simple labels. The fact that both the victim and offender were so young created questions that continue to provoke discussion among psychologists, educators, criminologists, and members of the public. What factors influence violent behavior? Can warning signs always be recognized? How should society respond when serious crimes involve juveniles? What balance should exist between punishment and rehabilitation? These questions do not have easy answers. They remain subjects of debate today. Yet perhaps the most enduring lesson from this case is not about crime. It is about attention. Attention to the people around us. Attention to warning signs when someone appears vulnerable. Attention to the importance of community. Throughout the investigation, one thing became clear. People cared deeply about Liberty. Friends searched for her. Family members refused to give up. Community members rallied together. More than 1,000 people attended her funeral. That extraordinary turnout reflected something powerful. A collective refusal to allow her life to pass unnoticed. A collective acknowledgement that she mattered. In a world where news cycles move quickly and public attention shifts constantly, that matters. Because remembrance itself becomes a form of respect. Every time Liberty's name is spoken. Every time her story is told. Every time someone reflects upon the lessons of her case. Her memory continues. Not as a victim alone, but as a person. As someone who existed. Someone who was loved. Someone whose life left an impact on others. True crime stories often attract audiences because people seek understanding. They want to know what happened. Why it happened. How investigators solved the mystery. Those questions are important. But perhaps the most valuable question is different. What should we learn from what happened? In Liberty's case, the answer may be found in empathy. Empathy for victims. Empathy for grieving families. Empathy for communities forced to process unimaginable events. Behind every investigation is human suffering. Behind every verdict is loss. Behind every headline is a story that extends far beyond the courtroom. As this story reaches its conclusion, the facts remain unchanged. On October 31, 2008, Liberty Templeman left a gathering of friends and never arrived at her destination. The following day, she was found dead near YROA Stream. A homicide investigation followed. Evidence led investigators to Theo Creel. A jury ultimately convicted him of murder and sexual violation. A sentence was imposed. The legal system reached its conclusion. Those are the facts. Yet facts alone cannot capture the full significance of what occurred. The true legacy of this case lies in its human impact. The lives altered. The futures changed. The memories preserved. The lessons learned. And perhaps that is where Liberty's story should finally rest. Not in the violence. Not in the courtroom. Not in the headlines. But in remembrance. Because at the center of every true crime case is a person whose life mattered long before tragedy arrived. A person who deserves to be remembered for more than the worst thing that happened to them. Liberty Templeman was one of those people. A daughter. A friend. A teenager with dreams she never had the chance to fulfill. Her story ended far too soon. But her memory continues. And as long as it does, she remains more than a victim. She remains human. She remains loved. And she remains unforgettable.